A soldier's duty is not to reason why. A soldier's duty is to do or die.
This is the story of the doing and the dying in the defining conflict of the 20th century.
I saw some of the most horrible incidents which a person would have to experience themselves before they would believe me.
The massive casualties of the war weighed heavily on my grandfather. It wasn't theory to him, it was people's children.
This is also the story of the reason why, of knowing why you fight.
Had we not won that war, then life as we know it would never have existed again.
It's your father's story, or grandfather's, but it's also yours.
You don't forget the horrors of war. As I tell some of my closest friends, if you ran over a cat while driving, would you ever forget that incident, that little bump when you ran over this cat? Most people would say, no, I'll remember that for the rest of my life. What about a human being if you shot him or blew his head off? Would you forget that?
Lebe unter Deutschland und seine in euch liegende Zukunft. Deutschland heil! Heil!
In Berlin, a Jewish boy named Ernest Conrad sits around the dinner table with his parents, who reassure each other that Hitler is a fad, destined to fail.
This cannot last. That was a feeling. This mankind is crazy, nuts. How can the Germans listen to him?
Die alte deutsche Reichsstadt Nürnberg heil!
What does he have to give?
Hitler's gift to Germany is a campaign of racist terror.
My dad had his citizenship. We all had our citizenship taken away. His bank accounts confiscated. His business is totally near dissolution.
It's not only Jews who face persecution. In March 1936, Hitler's troops sweep into the Rhineland, a German region demilitarized after World War I. Nazis sterilize hundreds of mixed-race children, whom Hitler calls the Rhineland bastards. Born to a German mother and an African father, Hans Hock is 16 years old when he is forcibly sterilized by a vasectomy.
Und dann sah ich an den Kindern, die dort saßen, ungefähr 30 Kinder, naja, das können nur Kameraden von mir sein. Also die hatten teilweise auch Schwärzer, teilweise Frauen und Gesichtsschnitt und so. Die Messungen, Schädelmessungen, hinten, vorne, Nasen, wurde dann gesagt, dass man zur Sterilisation verurteilt ist. Und dann, ich habe über mir die Uhr gehabt und das hat ungefähr über 40 Minuten gedauert. Und das ist nicht ganz schmerzlos, auch wenn das mit örtlicher Betäubung gemacht wird. Jedenfalls damals.
Couldn't escape from anybody. How increasingly the country was not only militarized, but terrorized.
In the summer of 1936, Berlin hosts the Olympics. Hitler and his Nazis look to showcase the superiority of the Aryan race. They don't count on the lightning-fast American Jesse Owens.
When Jesse Owens came into the stadium, he got a bigger ovation than Hitler.
Metcalf comes up, but Owens wins in 10.3.
Owens obliterates the competition, winning 4 gold medals. His teammate, Louis Zamperini, competes in the 5,000 meter and loses, but he runs a gutsy race, finishing strong. Hitler insists on meeting him.
He shook my hands and said, the boy with the fast finish. I mean, his face, his mustache, the way he combed his hair, it looked like somebody purposely did cosmetics on him for a comedy. He was, to us, a dangerous comedian.
Japanese forces overwhelm Shanghai and sweep across Nanking. In an orgy of violence, Japanese soldiers brutalize the defeated Chinese. Shang Ziqiang watches in horror as a Japanese soldier stabs his mother in the chest.
就哭喊不要抽妈妈，不要抽妈妈。这个时候呢，我那个顶小的弟弟不是给鬼子抽的掉地下了嘛？有个鬼子小弟弟在底下哭了，那个鬼子把我那2个弟弟抽倒了以后，看那小孩在哭，在我弟弟屁股高头一刺刀，一跳。
When the massacre ends after 6 terrifying weeks, nearly 200,000 corpses line the streets of Nanking. In Washington, President Roosevelt responds by cutting back trade with Japan. But the Japanese ignore the U.S. and keep expanding their empire. In January 1938, U.S. Ambassador to Germany, William Dodd, returns home and tries to sound the alarm on the global threat posed by Hitler.
Living in Europe these days is profoundly discouraging. Nazism and fascism are gaining ground everywhere. This is a world crisis.
Dodd's words fall on deaf ears, as most Americans would rather turn a blind eye to Europe's problems. Armin Lehman is a member of the Hitler Youth, being groomed as a future Aryan Superman. He says he was completely unaware of the mayhem taking place throughout the expanding German Empire.
People always ask, you know, how could it have happened? You must have seen the trucks drive up and loading the Jewish people, etc. I lived in a Nazi rent-controlled area. There was not a single Jewish family. You couldn't see what happened to the people who were not in tune with the Nazis.
September 1938. European leaders convene in Munich. They appease Hitler and let him keep half of Czechoslovakia.
The settlement of the Czechoslovakian problem, which has now been achieved, is, in my view, only the prelude to a larger settlement in which all Europe may find peace.
Just 6 months later, Hitler thumbs his nose at the world and occupies what is left of Czechoslovakia. Beginning in 1939, Jews under Nazi control must wear armbands identifying them as subhumans, what Hitler calls Untermenschen. To the east, in Moscow, Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin decides to join forces with Hitler and builds up a huge military force. Behind closed doors, the two powers draw up plans to carve up Eastern Europe. Poland sits in the crosshairs. The German war machine, the infamous Wehrmacht, unleashes a lightning war of overwhelming speed and power. It's called Blitzkrieg. Fast-moving tanks punch gaping holes in the Polish front lines, while the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, pummels the nation's capital, Warsaw.
A lot of them came back beaten up. A lot of them didn't come back at all. A few days later, you heard that on the marketplace. They held a few Jews in the middle of the night.
Within days, France and the British Empire, including India, Australia, and Canada, declare war on Germany.
We are all very naive. We always thought that the war will last only a very limited period of time. After all, we had powerful allies, Great Britain and France, and they are going to make sure that the war doesn't last very long.
In fact, the Allies have no intention of saving Poland and abandon her to the enemy. Hitler's ally, Stalin, now orders his army to join the Nazi invasion. In just 4 weeks, 66,000 Polish corpses litter the landscape. On September 27th, Warsaw surrenders. British and French armies mass on Germany's western border. In London, people wear gas masks, anticipating an attack. But the Allies stand down and once again hope to avoid conflict by doing nothing. London residents like Rick Brown steel themselves for war. Instead, he is surprised at what follows.
There were times during those early months which we called the phony war, because nothing went on. And we relaxed, the Home Guard was disbanded, people came back from being evacuated. It was a very peculiar time.
The phony war soon yields to the real one. May 10th, 1940. Hitler's legions blitz across Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Overhead, Luftwaffe pilots search out more targets for destruction.
Well, I must say, the first mission to me seemed to be very unimpressive.
German pilot Heinz Migeot roars into combat over the battlefield. The ease of his mission takes him aback.
We attacked some ground target and didn't encounter any enemy resistance, no fighter pilots, no anti-aircraft. And so when I landed, I asked myself, is that the war?
To the south, along their border with Germany, the French man a series of forts called the Maginot Line. The defenses, supposedly impenetrable, prove useless. The Germans simply bypass them and streak into France. One more deadly thrust, and Hitler will demand the surrender of both France and Great Britain.
You ask what is our policy? I will say it is to wage war by sea, land, and air, with all our might and with all the strength that God can give us. To wage war against a monstrous tyranny, never surpassed in the dark and lamentable catalogue of human crime. That is our policy.
By late May 1940, hundreds of thousands of Allied troops huddle here, near the northern French town of Dunkirk. They're pinned down and surrounded by the Wehrmacht, their backs flush against the English Channel.
It was absolute chaos. You could not believe what a war is like until you see what happened at Dunkirk.
Harry Garrett is one of those trapped soldiers.
It was just perpetual bombing, shelling, strafing, and the sand dunes where most of the boys were was all being sprayed all day long.
Hitler and his Luftwaffe commander, Hermann Goering, believe that German air power alone will force a massive and devastating Allied surrender. So just outside Dunkirk, the Germans halt their ground advance. Churchill seizes the moment, calling on all British boat owners to help the Royal Navy rescue the trapped soldiers. Over the course of 9 days, a ramshackle fleet of private boats, as well as Royal Navy vessels, rescues more than 330,000 soldiers. Harry Garrett escapes from Dunkirk on a small British destroyer.
We rushed on board, and we were lucky we were some of the last on board. I think he must have had about 500 people on this destroyer. A destroyer? It was like a sardine can. I think there's about 270 ships sunk in that harbour. That was so sad. You saw destroyers laying over the side and ships laying over the side. And then away we went up to England. It was so peaceful. And there was the Cliffs of Dover. I still feel that now.
Hitler's failure to push the ground attack against the Allies at Dunkirk stuns Luftwaffe pilot Heinz Migeot.
I know that our generals were fuming. It was a nonsense. We had allowed them to travel up to Dunkirk so that they could escape to England.
In the aftermath of Dunkirk, Winston Churchill emerges as the face and voice of British and Allied resolve.
We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
On June 10th, Italian fascist leader Benito Mussolini throws in with the Nazis and declares war on France. Four days later, German troops march into Paris. Triumphant German soldiers unfurl the swastika from the Eiffel Tower. And France surrenders to Hitler. The Luftwaffe begins bombing runs over the British coast and shipping convoys. Britain's Royal Air Force, alerted to impending attacks by a sophisticated new radar network, takes to the sky, including the deadly Hawker Hurricane and the Supermarine Spitfire. From his secret underground headquarters in London, Churchill runs the war and rallies his troops.
Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty. And for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
Bob Foster and Jeffrey Wellham are barely out of flight training when they're ordered to protect the skies from the invading Luftwaffe.
We were, I hesitate to say the amateurs, but we were, compared to the Germans, a crowd of chaps pulled together at the last minute, the desire to fly, to protect the country.
You then looked at it and thought, good God, what are they doing over here? Where do we start on this lot? What do you do? There's only one thing to do, is go straight in, have a quick squirt, and then away. Get down and think, God, I got away with that one, let's go back and do it again. And it was only after you finished you thought, oh, blimey. You know, this is bloody dangerous. You
can hear our own guns going like anything now. Somebody's hit a German and he's coming down this long streak, coming down completely out of control, a long streak of smoke. He's, there you can hear our anti-aircraft going at now. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, there are about 10 German machines dive bombing the British convoy, which is just out to sea in the Channel.
Then, on September 7th, 1940, the Nazis begin terror attacks, indiscriminate bombing of England's civilian population. Londoners have a word for it: the Blitz. In September 1940, the Luftwaffe begins the merciless bombing of London and its civilian population.
By and large, people were very fatalistic. What can we do? If there's one up there with my name on it, that's it.
Before it's over, nearly 40,000 men, women, and children will be dead, not just in London, but throughout England.
It was up close and personal, very much so. When you're 16, 17, and you're asked to help out in the docks of London, which were devastating, lots of casualties, bodies lying around.
Rick Brown is a teenage member of the British Home Guard. His job is to assist with the rescue and recovery teams.
Immediate impressions are the ones that stay. I don't really believe that any of us, young kids, realized the enormity of what was happening.
German aircraft relentlessly blast London and other cities, but the British fighters strike back hard and inflict enormous casualties. After weeks of stunning losses, Hitler realizes his Luftwaffe alone cannot beat the British. And while the Blitz continues, Hitler begins to turn his attention to his supposed ally, Russia. In September 1940, Japan, Italy, and Germany signed the Tripartite Pact and forged the so-called Axis powers. Their goal, quite simply, is to rule the world. And they seem well on their way. In the summer of 1941, President Roosevelt takes his biggest step yet to counter the Axis. The U.S. embargoes all metal shipments and oil deliveries to the Japanese Empire. The move cripples the empire's industry, and Japan now sees few options except war.
We Americans were looking at a threat in Europe and a threat in the Pacific. There was always the hope that the oceans would protect us on either side. But I don't think my grandfather ever believed you could rely on that.
Instead, FDR prepares for the oceans to become battlefields. On June 22, 1941, one brutal dictator double-crosses another as Adolf Hitler breaks his treaty with Joseph Stalin and invades the Soviet Union. A vast army of 3 million German troops unleashes a torrent of death and destruction. In the north, the Germans lay siege here at Leningrad and pound it into rubble. Food supplies quickly dry up. As the Russian winter sweeps in, the city's survivors are forced into desperate measures.
There were so many dead bodies out there, and other people would rush to these bodies like scavenger birds, and they stripped them of clothes, and they also cut flesh, made ground meat out of it and sold it, or they ate it themselves. But those who ate it ended up going insane.
Further south, German troops battle to within 15 miles of the capital, Moscow. But temperatures descend to 25 below. Weapons will not fire, and soldiers freeze to death. In early December, with Hitler's armies withering, the Soviets launch a vicious counterattack. For the first time in the war, the Germans retreat. Moscow is saved. The naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, houses the bulk of America's Pacific Fleet. 130 vessels rest on the placid waters. 390 aircraft park on adjacent airfields. Sailors and pilots enjoy the hospitality of nearby Honolulu. As the first Sunday in December 1941 dawns with light breezes and clear skies.
First thing I heard was music and disc jockey.
Daniel Inouye, a 17-year-old high school student living on Oahu, sits at home listening to the radio.
We have witnessed this morning the severe bombing of Pearl Harbor by enemy planes, undoubtedly Japanese. It is no joke, it is the real war.
I didn't know what he was talking about. I thought it was just part of the show. So I called my father and we looked out there, and then 3 planes came up, flying back from a run, gray with red sun drop dots on the wing. Then I knew war was on.
At 7:48 a.m., the first of over 350 Japanese dive bombers, fighters, and torpedo planes sweep out of the Hawaiian sky. Some target the airfields, where planes parked wing to wing are blasted into oblivion. Others head to Battleship Row.
We could see the torpedo planes come up and peel off. You could reach out and touch them. We could see them in the planes, and the dive bombers were hitting us with strafing us.
At Pearl Harbor, Don Stratton and Clint Westbrook are aboard the USS Arizona when an enemy bomb penetrates the deck and hits the ship's ammo dump.
We felt that. It shook the whole ship. And then the ship exploded. Then we were caught in the ball of flame that went about 400 or 500 feet in the air.
All I remember is suddenly to see the whole front of the ship disappear. And then it was blank after that because we were picked up, spun around, dropped, and everything else.
For 2 hours, the Japanese air squadrons hammer Pearl Harbor. At 9:45 a.m., the attack finally ends. The local hospitals overflow with the human carnage. Japanese-American teenager Daniel Inouye is a volunteer, assisting in the grisly cleanup.
I saw this body that was left over, no head. I got myself a box, put the parts in the box. The father came back. He was out doing some work, and he says, I want to see my wife. They told me my wife is wounded. And I told the man in charge, the doctor, I says, don't show it to him. Well, he has the right to see his wife. Okay. So he went into the morgue. I opened the box. He looked at that. He screamed and spent the rest of his life in an insane asylum.
The sneak attack destroys 188 aircraft, sinks 4 battleships and 3 destroyers. Almost every U.S. ship suffers some damage. But luckily, the all-important fleet of aircraft carriers are out to sea. When the Arizona sinks to the bottom of the harbor, it takes 1,102 trapped and drowned seamen with it. The next day, the United States Congress declares war.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
Within 24 hours of attacking Pearl Harbor, the Japanese also strike Hong Kong, Guam, the Philippines, Wake Island, and Midway Island. On December 11th, Adolf Hitler declares war on the U.S., officially drawing America into the European conflict.
Everything sort of starts with Pearl Harbor. Right after that happened, you know, if he an able-bodied guy with 2 arms and 2 legs of the right age without a uniform on, I'd wonder what was wrong with you, you know.
I couldn't wait to get into the service to do something to stop Hitler. He was really gobbling up a lot of countries, and he had to be stopped.
At a conference in January 1942 outside Berlin, the Nazis established their so-called final solution for dealing with enemies of the Aryan race. This document from the conference catalogs 11 million Jews from 31 countries to be killed. The Nazis build 3 types of facilities. Concentration camps house Nazi enemies and are located in Germany. Slave labor camps imprison civilians in Nazi-occupied territory. Extermination camps, mostly in Poland, are designed to kill as many Jews as quickly as possible. These camps include medical laboratories to perform horrifying experiments on the prisoners, as well as data centers to track the results.
They sent our group down east to talk with Jimmy Doolittle.
Pilot Thomas Griffin trains in Columbia, South Carolina, where Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle comes looking for volunteers.
Doolittle came in and said that we were going to train to take these B-25 Mitchell bombers off the deck of a carrier. We're going to go across the Pacific and bomb targets in Japan. That's the first we knew of it.
In April 1942, Doolittle leads his pack of 16 B-25 bombers as they prepare to launch here from the deck of the USS Hornet. The carrier closes to within 650 miles of Japan when an enemy patrol boat spots the Americans and relays their position to Tokyo. Doolittle's cover is blown. His next decision changes the face of the war. April 18th, 1942. His plane short of their launch point, his operation uncovered by the enemy. Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle goes all in. On this aircraft carrier, he orders his raid on Tokyo.
Jimmy Doolittle, of course, flew the first plane off. Now, it was a very stormy morning, high seas. So we were very fortunate on that short takeoff, 400 feet, that all of us stayed on the deck and got off.
Doolittle's bombers reached Tokyo at high noon.
The target we had was a factory making tanks right on Tokyo Bay. And our plane did not hit that assigned target. We hit its immediate neighbor, Tokyo Gas and Electric Company, and flattened it.
But the early launch burns through the Raiders' fuel, and some of the B-25s begin to fall into the Pacific.
2 people were drowned, 8 of them got ashore.
Most of Doolittle's raiders make it to China, but crash well short of their objectives.
We flew on till we got to where we thought we were as close as we could get to where we wanted to go. We weren't precisely there, and then we all jumped.
The damage in Tokyo is negligible. But the Doolittle operation delivers a huge boost to a demoralized American public.
Everything was going the other way, all bad news. Down in North Africa, Rommel was driving the British back towards Cairo, and they were sinking our ships in the Atlantic, submarines, wholesale. In the Pacific, things were even worse. After Pearl Harbor, everything was bad news on our side until our little mission of bombing Tokyo.
Allied forces in the Philippines are no match for the battle-tested Japanese invaders. Even so, the American and Filipino troops hold out for 4 months during the bloody Battle of Bataan. In early April 1942, 75,000 starving, disease-ridden soldiers finally surrender.
From that time, we marched a distance of approximately 140 miles.
Among the POWs is U.S. Army Air Force Captain Samuel Gracio, a survivor of what becomes known as the Bataan Death March.
En route, many Americans were bayoneted and run over by Japanese equipment. They not only were starved to death and wanted water, but were beaten up.
In temperatures approaching 100 degrees, the Japanese forced the prisoners to bake in the sun.
We used to gather the American and Filipino troops in the rays of the tropic sun. Many of the boys suffering from malaria were forced to sit there for hours, consuming the sun. Many of them were bareheaded due to the fact that the Japanese soldiers in their cruelty took the hats away from the Americans and just threw them away. This treatment was one of the tortures which is uppermost in my mind, a torture which I'll never be able to forget.
After 5 days, the first of the marchers arrive at an abandoned military outpost. Here, the torture continues. It includes the beheadings of American and Filipino soldiers.
I saw some of the most horrible incidents which a person would have to experience themselves before they would believe me. I hate to think of the many Americans and Filipinos who will never get back to tell the torture that was given to them before God blessed them with death.
The Japanese Empire now spreads across much of East Asia, and the threat to Australia grows by the day. The Allies need Australia as a base of operations, and Japan hopes to isolate her by cutting her shipping lanes. To accomplish the mission, Tokyo organizes a large force to occupy the Coral Sea. But Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Ocean area, operates with a remarkable advantage. U.S. intelligence operators crack the Japanese naval code and intercept enemy orders. Nimitz now knows that a huge Japanese fleet is steaming into the Coral Sea. The American commander boldly counters force with force.
We spotted 15 ships in the Coral Sea heading south. There were 4 of us flying fortresses.
After his bombs fail to drop, Bombardier Meyer Levin convinces his pilot to make another run. He spots a Japanese transport ship filled with infantry.
We were throwing up just about as much ack-ack as I've ever seen at one time in my life. Well, and I let my eggs go, 8 500s, faced them all around the bow. I believe I probably sunk her.
After 5 days of intense fighting, both sides withdraw. Japanese Commander Yamamoto believes the U.S. Navy is now on the ropes. He dispatches nearly his entire fleet to assault Midway Island, a critical stepping stone on the way to Hawaii.
There was some debate as to what their target was.
Max Showers toils as a code breaker in a basement at Pearl Harbor.
People in Washington felt that such a large Japanese operation would not go to such a small island as Midway.
But Mac and his fellow code breakers at Pearl Harbor are certain that Midway is the target. They need proof, and fast. They devise a scheme to send a fake message to smoke out the Japanese.
We proposed that we send a message to the commanding officer of our base at Midway so it would be sure to be seen and read and understood by the Japanese.
The Japanese pick up the fake communication and radio new orders to the fleet, which Max Showers and his team intercept and decode. The message pinpoints Midway as the target of the Japanese assault.
We knew it would be Midway and had settled a dispute with Washington.
As June begins, the Japanese steam toward Midway. Unaware, they are sailing right into a trap.
Bombs were landing on either side of the runway. The Japanese didn't want to bomb the runways because they wanted to use them. So they were bombing ammo dumps and fuel dumps and a mess hall.
Returning planes crowd the decks of Japanese aircraft carriers. Admiral Yamamoto is unaware that U.S. carriers, tipped off by American codebreakers, lurk nearby. Suddenly, waves of planes launched from the American carriers fill the sky.
What did you first think when you first saw the enemy? Well, we've been looking for him for a long time. Thank God they're here. I got a couple of good shots at a couple of the fighters. Oh, you did? Knock them down. Well, they didn't come back. Second day we hit the carriers. You luck with them? Oh, yes. Knocked right in there.
The Japanese still managed to blast 147 U.S. aircraft out of the sky. But the Americans sink 4 enemy aircraft carriers, throwing the Japanese Navy on the defensive for the first time in the war. one day on Guadalcanal. The Marines seize the landing area and rename it Henderson Field. Platoon Sergeant Ned Steele is taken aback by the ease of the mission.
It was a piece of cake. Of course, that didn't last very long. We were unpleasantly surprised when we did finally meet Jap resistance and found out just what they were. They were barbarians. They didn't have any code of honor at all.
Steele's opinion hardens when he comes across his first Marine casualty.
We ran across him laying in the trail. They'd cut his head off, had his arms folded, and his head was sitting on his chest. They'd cut his penis off, stuck it in his mouth. I gotta take a break.
For the next 3 months, the Marines battle across the jungle island. The action ranges from small, vicious firefights to large-scale attacks. The conditions are appalling.
A lot of people that got sick, malaria, dysentery, tropical ulcers, all kinds, and that's what killed us. You couldn't cure a lot of things that in the tropics there unless you got out of the tropics.
There wasn't one day or 1 hour that you weren't in danger of being killed. You were shot at, sniped, you were bombed, shelled, strafed, you were everything. You never could relax. You didn't sleep. If you got 2-3 hours a night's sleep, you were getting it in 10 or 15-minute increments because you're always awake, always aware.
Just after midnight on November 14th, 1942, the bloodshed culminates on the high seas north of Guadalcanal.
And at about then, all hell broke loose. Watch shells going down, and some of those armor-piercing shells would go right through a ship and come out the other side. You could see them.
Japanese cruisers and destroyers pound the battleship USS South Dakota and knock her out of action.
It occurred to me that somebody had strewn a whole lot of life jackets on the floor. So I went, what the hell are all these life jackets doing here? So I took a peek with my flashlight, and they were not life jackets, they were bodies that I was trampling on.
Through grim determination, the U.S. Navy holds off the Japanese fleet and forces them to withdraw.
We went out after the battle. It was all over with the next day, looking for survivors and see what we could find. There was the ships all around, burning. Oh, it must have been hundreds of Japanese floating around in there in the water.
By early February 1943, the last of the Japanese pull off the island of Guadalcanal.
We were a bunch of kids that didn't know anything. We actually never thought we were going to leave Guadalcanal.
When we invaded North Africa, that was our first major action.
On November 8, 1942, U.S. General Dwight David Eisenhower orders 63,000 American and British troops to hit the beaches of Morocco and Algeria. Ike is looking to break a deadly stalemate between Allied and Axis troops further east in Egypt. Among the U.S. troops waiting ashore is Chief Petty Officer Wilbur Idson.
This is a very frightening thing. The first action is horrible. Most of the enlisted men were hiding under the table. I don't know what they were hiding from. If we got a shell, they would sure get it.
The operation is risky, the stakes enormous. But here on the sands of North Africa, Eisenhower decides to strike the first American blow against Germany and Italy. November 1942, Allied forces land on the beaches of North Africa. Heavy fighting greets them. But within a few days, the Vichy French troops in Morocco surrender, allowing General George S. Patton and the Allies to move east with impunity.
And that was the beginning of the relief of the British Eighth Army that was fighting Rommel.
While Patton moves east across Morocco and into Algeria, the British, under General Bernard Montgomery, blast westward through General Erwin Rommel's lines into Libya. That leaves Germany's so-called Desert Fox no choice but to retreat. 6 months later, the Axis will abandon North Africa altogether. In the summer of 1942, Hitler orders his generals to retake the ground lost after the Moscow debacle. The resupplied Wehrmacht fights its way to the gates of Stalingrad, where German artillery and the Luftwaffe quickly level the city.
Sometimes you would go through the ruins, rummage through, and then find a boy. You would get him out, and he would be crying as he lost his mother.
Stalin orders the Red Army to defend the city at all costs. Any soldier retreating or surrendering will be shot.
It was very scary. I was simply a wuss. The bullets were flying all over the place, but it seemed like they all aimed at me, that they all wanted to take me, and it was quite a fright.
Hitler's forces are exhausted and overwhelmed. They have no answer to the Russian onslaught. On February 2nd, 1943, General Friedrich Paulus becomes Hitler's first field marshal to choose surrender over suicide. He gives up his 91,000 bedraggled German troops to the Soviets. Only 5,000 will survive in Russian captivity. Hunted for almost 2 years, the triumphant Red Army becomes the hunter. With able-bodied Americans volunteering in droves, Earl McClung and Buck Compton enlist in the 101st Airborne. They are a new breed of American warrior, the paratrooper, or airborne soldier.
They called us into a big building and they gave us a spiel about airborne troops, and people jump out of airplanes, and everybody wanted to know what did anybody want to do that for. And they said, well, you get $50 extra a month, and my hand went up.
Well, it's the idea of getting behind their line, getting it into the interior. I'm not sure it's a great idea, but that was the theory, that you could get a lot of soldiers in behind their line and do mischief.
Battles now rage from Southeast Asia to Western Russia, and from the Aleutian Islands to Africa. Earl McClung and his buddies hunger to join the fight.
Oh, I think we had probably one of the biggest egos in the world. It was all young kids, you know. And we thought we were indestructible. We were kind of wanting to get into combat, and then after we were there a few times, then we was trying to figure out ways of getting out of it.
U.S. Army Ranger Ray Sadusky rides in on the first wave of troops invading Sicily.
They hit a sandbar, and they dropped me off, and I went into about 10, 12 feet of water. So I learned, if you ever go into water like that, you're not going to be able to swim. So just use your arms like this, to keep doing this, and keep walking. And I walked right up on shore. So I look back, nobody's coming in but me. I said, I hope they don't call this beachhead off and leave me there.
Ray Sadusky is part of the first Allied wave to hit the beaches in Sicily in July 1943. He immediately comes under heavy machine gun fire from 2 Italian enemy soldiers. 20 minutes pass before fellow Army Rangers arrive.
And I hear him yelling, calling my name. Hey, Ray, where are you? I said, be careful when you're coming over here. I said, they've got 2 machine guns crossfiring. So they came in, they gave him to come up with a bazooka gunner, and he knocked them both up.
In the Pacific, the victory at Guadalcanal allows the Allies to pursue 2 lines of attack. One along New Guinea, focused on the Philippines. Another starting in the Gilbert Islands, aimed directly at Japan. As the Marines close in on the Tarawa beach, a storm of fire erupts from the Japanese defenses.
We didn't know what we were getting into. We were too dumb to know, and it may have been a point in our favor. We might not have gone.
There was heavy shelling, you know, and you couldn't see the island, you know, it was covered with smoke.
As the Marines approach, it becomes clear that the U.S. has miscalculated the tides, making it impossible to drive their landing vessels to shore.
You could hear the noise of the tractor treads crawling across the coral, and about that time you begin to sense something wasn't right.
Instead, Marines Howard Frost and John Pease find themselves stranded waist-deep in the water 500 yards from shore, exposed to withering enemy fire.
We jumped off the side of the amphibious tractor and ran ashore as quick as we could. Amongst the dead bodies,
once ashore, the Marines realize they face an entrenched enemy that would rather die than give up 1 inch of Tarawa.
The Japs have spent every day and night for 15 months getting the island ready for a fight.
Combat cameraman Norman Hatch narrates the footage he shot in the heat of the action.
The Japs kept coming out, trying to knock out the machine gun. There's one of them. That sniper's got a beat on another. There's a squad of them. Boy, it was hot that day and was I sweating. The camera tells the truth, but it doesn't give you any idea of how it smelled. And the smell on that island was bad. The wounded started going back 6 minutes after we hit the beach. And the stretcher bearers, all members of the shore party, were the unsung heroes of Tarawa. Plenty of them got hit.
The Marines overcome early mistakes and, after 4 brutal and bloody days of combat, hammer out an important victory.
It was totally destroyed. The island was practically leveled.
Nearly 2,000 American dead are buried near the airfield. The island's defenders are nearly all wiped out.
No vegetation, there was just nothing except equipment, decomposed bodies. It was something I don't ever want to see again.
After the fall of North Africa and the capture of Sicily, Allied troops continue to pound the Axis forces. In September, the Allies cross onto the Italian mainland at Salerno and sweep north along the Boot.
I was on a patrol soon after we landed in Italy. While I was walking on this patrol on the next mountain, on the top, I could see someone squatting, moving his bowels, defecating. You could tell he was a German.
Japanese-American soldier Daniel Inoue is part of the 442nd Combat Team.
He had on this German hat. So I told the men, that's mine. Just like that deer is mine. I very carefully set my sights. He was not only my first, but when I think back with horror because I was proud. But I was trained to hate the Germans. All the propaganda films we saw throughout training, it made you feel good. You're a good soldier. That's war.
In January 1944, these mountains south of Rome are the front lines of the European war. At the center of the action stands the 1,400-year-old abbey at Monte Cassino.
They warned
the Germans not to use the monastery as a battleground.
By international law, this holy site is supposed to be off limits for any military use. But its bird's eye view dominates the ground for miles. And though the Germans are not occupying it, the Allies are convinced otherwise.
We saw the activity change from day to day, so American forces bombed it.
On February 15, 1944, Allied air power levels the Abbey. The Germans occupy the ruins, and the battle rages on. And east of Monte Cassino, a new element is about to be added to the war effort. For 4 months, Allied forces struggled to gain the upper hand in these mountains south of Rome.
Most of the time it was rainy, and we were climbing the mountains there. It was mud and everything. We were taking a beating.
Finally, on June 4th, 1944, the Allies crack the Axis defenses and march into Rome, where the Italian people greet them as liberators. But the battle for Italy is far from over. The Black Airmen were trained in Tuskegee, Alabama, to be escort fighter pilots under the hard eye of Colonel Benjamin O. Davis.
He says, gentlemen, your duty is to fly escorts, which means you escort those bombers from the time that you pick your bombers up over the target. You bring them all home safely. That's your duty. That's your responsibility.
Davis emphasizes the importance of mission discipline.
He says, if any of you ever, for any reason, should leave a bomber, go off looking for a fighter, you can shoot down 10 fighters, but when you come back here, I'll court-martial you. If you are engaged by enemy fighters, then you engage, but you will not go off looking for a fight.
Long-range bombers typically sustain heavy losses from enemy attacks. But the Red Tails, as they are called, quickly earn a reputation for protecting their bombing squadrons no matter what.
The bombers would ask, hey, who's escorting us today? Well, it's not the Red Tails. What, the Red Tails aren't escorting us today? Oh, man, you know, yeah, they wanted us.
With the Red Tails in action, U.S. bomber losses fall dramatically. In the skies above Europe, the Black Army Air Force unit delivers the goods.
In the months leading up to the Normandy invasion, Operation Overlord, my grandfather was used primarily as a ruse.
General Eisenhower orders George Patton to help create the illusion that the Allies planned to cross the English Channel, not at Normandy, but at Calais.
And he was commanding a fictitious army group that was made up of inflatable tanks and cardboard vehicles, tents, and essentially a ghost army, if you will.
as 160,000 soldiers steam across the English Channel. The airborne units still in England prepare for action. General Eisenhower arrives to wish them luck. Waves of planes then take off to drop the 23,400 paratroopers at their landing zones in Normandy, behind enemy lines.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well trained, well equipped, and battle hardened. He will fight savagely.
We weren't scared to jump. We were scared of getting shot down in that airplane.
When the planes cross into France, German anti-aircraft fire turns the skies into a death zone. Paratroopers Buck Compton and Earl McClung get caught in the maelstrom.
Shrapnel and bullets were going through the fuselage of those old C-47s like a beehive in there. And everybody was hollering, "Let's get the hell out of here."
In the chaos, Buck Compton loses most of his gear before he hits the ground.
When I landed, I didn't have a weapon, I didn't have any rations, I didn't have anything on me, and a couple of those chocolate bar rations and a canteen and a trench knife, and that's all I had. Ready to fight the Germans.
Some of the Allied paratroopers land in the village of Sainte-Mère-Église and are butchered before they even reach the ground. Many are captured. Most, however, wander the countryside and slowly organize. To their north, the guns of Normandy explode. At about 6:30 a.m. on June 6, 1944, the Allied invasion comes ashore on the beaches of Normandy. 83,000 British and Canadian troops land at Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. 73,000 Americans of the U.S. First Army land at Utah and Omaha beaches.
As soon as we hit the beach, everybody was not in ordinary panic, but there was wild confusion. When you're trained to do a certain thing, you do it automatically. You're gonna hit a little resistance, keep on moving. But the resistance was deadly and highly effective. And we began to crumble.
When the landing barge goes down and you have to start running out, that's when you realize you're being shot at.
The whole beach was instantly wild. The noise is deafening. And I saw pink water, and eventually it turned red, just from blood. All that water there was blood red.
You got to the beaches, you crawl, and you can lay down, you crawl. I lay down next to a man who was been hit. He was dead already.
Infantryman Sam Fuller is trapped on Omaha Beach with little cover. Bombers dispatched early that morning to blast foxholes in the sand have missed their targets, providing no cover for the thousands of men pouring onto shore.
It was like hitting a tornado against another tornado. That's the way we felt. There's nowhere to go. You're stuck. You start trying to go forward, you're hit. If you're not, the snipers all over the place. There's a lot of riflemen. We couldn't stop the waves of men coming and coming and coming every 5, 10, 12, 15 minutes.
Fuller survives thanks to the boldness of his colonel, George A. Taylor.
He stood up, which is suicide. And he said, there are two kinds of men on this beach. Those who are dead and those who are about to die. So let's get off this damn beach and die inland. He stood up. And it's hard to explain to you what that little thing means. And he let us off the beach, right through the breach.
South of Utah Beach, behind enemy lines, Buck Compton meets up with several members of Easy Company and acquires a machine gun from an injured American soldier. They hear Germans firing at the beach.
So I got out and crawled on my belly about 50 yards into a trench works over there, and that's when I saw these Germans. I thought I'd jump through this bush and into this trench, and I'd just take them down with the machine gun, you know.
Compton jumps into the trench and pulls the trigger. American paratrooper Buck Compton finds himself in an enemy trench at Normandy, staring down two German soldiers. He fires his machine gun, and nothing happens.
And they looked at me and were surprised, and they took off running. And lucky as hell, I just pulled out this hand grenade and pulled a pin on it and let it fly. And it came down right on top of one of their heads and went off and killed them both with one hand grenade.
Also behind enemy lines, paratrooper Earl McClung discovers the advantage of capturing or killing German officers.
With the Germans, if you could get their officers, they were confused. They were good soldiers as long as they had somebody tell them what to do. But if they had to do something on their own, they weren't all that great.
And while McClung and his comrades honor the rules of engagement with the ordinary German soldiers, their courtesy does not extend to the murderous Nazis of Hitler's elite forces, the Waffen-SS.
The SS had already told us they wouldn't take any airborne prisoners. They wouldn't take us prisoners, we wouldn't take them prisoners. That's it. That was it. And as far as I know, we lived up to it to the very end. You were SS, you were dead.
Allied air forces rule the skies. And on June 6th, all of Normandy's beaches are secure. The British and Canadians begin their march inland. The Americans at Utah Beach face the lightest resistance of the day, losing only 197 of the 23,000 troops. They push forward and begin to make contact with scattered paratroopers. But the U.S. forces at Omaha Beach have the roughest go, losing 2,400 men.
I can remember several young boys who came in, stepped on landmines, and both of their legs were blown off. And they just, with just a little bit of despair, that they'd never be able to dance again, and what would my wife think, or what would my girl think, or how's my mother going to accept this? And often they didn't even live to go home. If you allow yourself to weep, you could be in tears all the time. Then you couldn't function.
After 4 years, the Allies have returned to France.
We did one thing that was good. We stopped the cancer from growing. We eliminated it.
Saipan, one thing that bothered me a little bit, we lost, when the Marines that we that were hitting the beach. They were being picked off like mad.
Radio operator Reby Carey is stationed on an attack transport off the coast of Saipan.
Let me tell you, that's a different ball game when their bombs start falling and going on. They even had bodies floating by our ship. You couldn't even get them out. I mean, it was something on that first day of Saipan.
The Japanese defend every inch of Saipan with suicidal abandon. For the first time, white and black Marines fight together to force the enemy from the mountainous terrain, one bloody step at a time. After 3 weeks of intense combat, the Marines claim the island. The Allies now dig in just 1,100 miles from Japan. Normandy's beaches quickly become the focal point for the Allied war effort. Within a few weeks, 600,000 troops come ashore to take on the Germans. South of the beachhead, Normandy's narrow roads are lined by walls of rock, dirt, and thick vegetation called hedgerows.
We start hitting the hedgerows. And when we hit the hedgerows, it's when we were losing a lot of men.
Too tall to surmount and too thick to penetrate, these hedgerows provide perfect cover for the outnumbered Germans. Hitler's armored divisions arrive and stop the Allied advance cold.
We'd be in one hedgerow and the enemy would be in the other hedgerow, which the other hedgerow was about 100 feet of open space. We had to go in that open space to crawl and get to the enemy that was in the hedgerows firing at us.
These big, gritty hedgerows that were not allowing them to break out and move with great speed. This was a big problem.
In order for armored units to break through Normandy and sweep across central France to Paris, the hedgerows must be breached. One ingenious American sergeant fashions iron-pronged extensions that easily attach to the front of the tanks. The men call them rhinos.
And the tanks were able to plow through and make openings for us. And that's the way we took over the hedgerows. Then it started where you'd be chasing the German armies that were running backwards. And as they fell back, we were just following them, firing at them.
Close air support chews up German counterattacks, while General George Patton pushes his Third Army hard. His men don't disappoint.
And they did so with incredible success. In 3.5 weeks, they got all the way to Paris.
Louis Zamperini has come a long way since the 1936 Olympics. He completes 5 successful missions as a bombardier in the Pacific. But on his 6th, his plane loses power and crashes into the ocean. The Japanese capture Zamperini and toss him in a prison camp on the island of Omori. Louis finds himself in the crosshairs of a sadistic guard named Mutsuhiro Watanabe, otherwise known as the Bird.
No matter where I was, he'd find me. Oh, Zamperini, you come to attention last. For no reason at all, I'm punched out every day.
The Japanese do not recognize the Geneva Conventions and brutalize their prisoners. Over 27% of POWs die in Japanese captivity. Zamperini's misery serves as amusement for the guards.
He'd line up 5 or 6 officers, then he'd get enlisted men to insult us and have the enlisted men punch us out. If they didn't hit us hard, they got hit. So we'd say, hey, go ahead and hit us hard. But that was the word.
At the end of August, Patton was really at the height of his powers. He had covered several hundred miles of territory and conquered half of France and liberated Paris in less than 4 weeks.
The tank conditions were ideal. We had long nights, short days, and the ground was absolutely dry. The tanks could go anywhere.
Tank Commander Al Erzik rolls with Patton's Third Army as they press the German border south of the Ardennes forest. But as autumn fades, one of the worst winters in Europe's history grips the front lines. The Germans launch a surprise offensive.
They attacked under the worst possible conditions, but they knew they were going to do it, they were ready for it, and we were not. So the advantage went to them.
A massive German force attacks the Allies on a 70-mile front, centered in the rugged Ardennes forest. Thick cloud cover keeps Allied planes grounded, unable to exploit their air superiority. A German breakthrough here could cripple or even reverse the Allied push toward Germany. The frontline SS troops show their typical disdain as they loot and burn across the area. Near the town of Malmedy, they murder more than 300 American POWs. The Allied lines scramble to firm up. But German armored columns punch a huge bulge in the American defenses, threatening to split the Allied advance in two. For both sides, no point is more crucial than Bastogne. All major roads intersect this small Belgian town. The 101st Airborne, including Buck Compton and Earl McClung, is ordered into the breach. But as they make their way into Bastogne, they're confronted with their fellow troops in retreat.
We start going up the road, and pretty soon we see these American soldiers coming this way with no weapons and their eyes bugged out. They had been overrun. That division just actually, under fire, caved in, and we had to go and plug it up.
The 101st truck into Bastogne and join the town's ragged defenders.
We were just getting the hell shelled out of us. God-awful bombardment. You know, I could taste the gunpowder in my mouth from the air.
They asked us how we survived. Some of the guys didn't, you know. They lost arms, legs, feet, ears, hands. They say I was out there hunting Germans all the time. I was out there walking to keep warm. That's what I was to keep from freezing to death.
The Americans defending the Belgian town earned the nickname the Battered Bastards of Bastogne.
We knew we were surrounded. We were just one beat-up division against 7.
In fierce fighting, the Germans failed to pierce the American defenses. When the Germans offer terms for surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe replies, nuts.
When the Germans got the word nuts, they said, nuts, nuts, what that, nuts? They didn't understand that at all.
The only person who stood up and said that he was able to do so was my grandfather. He said very famously that he could engage 3 divisions in 48 hours. Now keep in mind that his troops were about 100 miles south of Bastogne. Eisenhower just didn't believe it. My grandfather passed along the code words to his chief of staff, play ball, and 3 divisions turned and quickly engaged the Germans near Bastogne.
We moved all night, all day, and half the next night, and these terrible, slippery, icy roads, and we got within 8 miles of Bastogne.
At close range, Herzig recognizes the enormous scale of the German effort.
Theirs was a massive attack that not only affected us, but it affected the whole Allied front. This was infantry divisions, this was tank divisions. The Germans got everything that was available to them at that time.
The Third Army wades into the action and presses the German lines.
They kept going, and we finally stopped them, and then the fight continued because we had to push them back. See, we opened the corridor into Bastogne.
Patton's Third Army lifts the siege on the day after Christmas, 1944.
As soon as the sky cleared, there's a C-47 and P-51 sitting right there. When that sky cleared and those fighters got in there, they just devastated that.
Pounded from every direction. The great Nazi gamble to split the Allies in half fails. Private First Class Ralph Martire comes across a teenage German soldier, one of the many boys Hitler is now sending to the front.
I overtook him. I hit him with the rifle, and he fell down. And I was going to bayonet him when he start calling for his mother. He start going, "Mommy, mommy, mommy." I says, "Why are you calling for your mother?" He says, "I don't want to die." He says, "I want my mommy." I said, "All right, I'll tell you what. I'm gonna make it look like I stabbed you. Pretend you're dead when I move away from you." "Okay," he said, "okay." And I did it.
In Manila, the local Japanese commander tries to save the huge capital city from destruction and orders an evacuation. But 20,000 rogue soldiers refuse and remain behind. The Americans find themselves in a raging street fight. The Japanese unleash a reign of terror on the civilian population. The Allies finally prevail. The city destroyed. 100,000 of her inhabitants dead in the streets. By January 1945, the Allies have fought through the Marshall and Mariana Islands. They now target Japan's last two strongholds, Iwo Jima and Okinawa.
This lieutenant said, well, he says, you guys got a piece of cake. He said, within about 5 to 7 days, he said, we should be home. Yes, sir. We took his word for it. He lied.
The Japanese have spent years preparing Iwo Jima for battle. The island is on the doorstep of their mainland, and they intend to fight for every inch.
I figured when I went into Iwo Jima that my chances of coming out were nil.
Marines Bill Emerson, Richard Fisk, and 70,000 other Americans hit Iwo Jima's beaches in February 1945. The Japanese stopped them dead in their tracks. Especially deadly is the fire crashing down from the looming slopes of Mount Suribachi.
The Japanese were embedded. They were up on Suribachi, and they were firing an 8-inch coastal gun point blank at the troops on the beach. As long as they held that way, they controlled the island.
For 3 days, the Marines ruthlessly battle across the island and isolate Suribachi from the rest of the defenders. U.S. patrols soon find a route to the crest of the mountain.
It took us 4 days to take Mount Suribachi. We haven't even touched the rest of the island. At the cost of about almost 1,000 Marines.
On the 4th day, the Marines on Mount Suribachi send a message to the enemy and Americans back home.
I just turn around and look, glance that way every now and then. And I can see that something's happening back there. And they're putting up this big flag. We were only there 4 days up to that point, and casualties had been bad. Well, it's hard to describe that moment.
The battle for Iwo Jima is not over. Japanese defenses are a forbidding maze of underground bunkers, sniper nests, and fortified caves.
They wouldn't come out in the open. The underground part of this island is hard to comprehend. It was really a case of they had to be rooted out of every cave or burned.
Finally, after 5 weeks, the Marines take the island. They lay 6,300 of their dead comrades in long trenches. just over 1,000 Japanese surrender. The rest are dead.
If there was a hell, we went through it on Iwo Jima. I have never in my life been through anything like that. The carnage, the death was you'd have to be there to see it.
All across the Western Front, the Allies swarm into Germany.
We were in the Ruhr Valley. The Ruhr Valley was cut off, and our division's job was to cut the Ruhr Valley in half.
Sergeant Jacob Baruth marches with the 121st Infantry Division as they cross the Rhine and trap hundreds of thousands of demoralized Germans near the Ruhr River. He finds shocking remnants of Nazi fanaticism, known as the Lebensborn program, or Spring of Life.
We captured a baby factory. A baby factory was a lot of little cottages, and they bring in the German Aryans. They had to be 6 foot tall, blonde, blue-eyed, 6 generations of being Germans, at least. And they brought in the women. The women became pregnant. The men were sent back to the line. The women were having the babies. Then when the babies, I think it was 3 months, they left, and the babies were going to be raised by the state. They were going to be the Praetorian Guard of the German army for the future.
"1,300 Allied aircraft appear in the night skies over the German city of Dresden. Wave after wave drop 4,000 tons of explosives and incendiaries, igniting an epic firestorm that turns the city, a major rail hub, into an ocean of fire.
See people sitting there as though they were on a streetcar, as though they were on a tram. And they had, what had killed them was lack of oxygen, and they didn't even know it was happening to them.
22-year-old U.S. Army private and future novelist Kurt Vonnegut is being held in Dresden as a POW.
We had never seen anything like it before, and had no idea that our side was capable of such indiscriminate destruction. The results were just a total calamity of civilization.
One estimate places civilian casualties at 100,000. The Allied bombs turned Dresden, like most of the Third Reich, into rubble. Eager to strike hard blows against the Empire, General Curtis LeMay introduces a new strategy to attack Japan. Risk greater American losses by flying in low, hit the targets with more precision, and kill as many Japanese as possible. LeMay orders the use of incendiaries to create firestorms similar to the Dresden operation. Tail gunner Richard Vanden Heuvel is assigned to LeMay's unit.
You burn. If an area you saw wasn't burning, that's where they dropped their bombs.
The assault groups sweep in anywhere from 4,000 to 5,000 feet over Tokyo and drop their loads.
We just burned out the city, just completely, and put them on fire.
The firestorm incinerates more than 80,000 civilians. Less than 350 miles from the Japanese mainland, Okinawa is defended by over 100,000 troops. Here, too, Japanese soldiers battle to the end. But the Americans encounter great numbers of civilians, including this woman, who would also rather jump to their deaths than risk capture by the hated enemy. On April 12, 1945, with war still raging, FDR suffers a stroke and dies. Vice President Harry S. Truman, with whom Roosevelt rarely spoke, is hastily sworn in as president.
When he came to see us, he was in very, very bad physical shape.
Hitler Youth Armin Lehmann is part of a delegation that is allowed to meet Der Fuhrer on his 56th birthday.
He was shaking so badly that he had to grasp his jacket just to control his shaking. So then he brought his arm forward and shook my hand. And he said, "Wieder ein braver Junge," which meant, again, a brave boy.
The company commander called all the officers together, and he made a startling announcement. He says, "The war is over. Don't tell your men about it."
In Tuscany, Second Lieutenant Daniel Inouye's commander warns him to keep his men on alert.
We'll keep on fighting with the same intensity. Because if we slack, it's just going to prolong the war and more people will die.
On April 21st, 1945, Inouye and his platoon are under heavy fire trying to take a ridge in San Terenzo.
I had a bullet through my abdomen. Somehow it didn't strike anything precious, just flesh. Then all of a sudden there were 3 machine gun nests. I told the men, "Stay down." Got blood all over the place. And so I said, "Get back there."
Knowing the war will soon be over matters little to Inouye. He has been trained to lead his men and to destroy the enemy. He can do no less. In a blistering firefight with Axis troops in northern Italy, Second Lieutenant Daniel Inouye takes a bullet through the stomach. Ignoring the pain, he tosses grenades at 2 enemy machine gun nests. He prepares to throw a third grenade.
My grenade struck home, but the second one somehow had a rifle grenade and my elbow disappeared.
An enemy projectile shreds Inouye's right arm, but his lifeless hand still grips his live grenade.
My only concern was the grenade in that right hand. I pulled it out and then used my gun to wipe out the third one. Then I got hit in the leg, and that was it.
Inouye remains at the front for 6 hours until he is finally evacuated.
I had to make certain that the men were assigned to their right places. I told my sergeant, I'm going to tell you a secret you don't tell anyone else. I told him about the war being over. No heroics. Next day he got killed.
Italian partisans captured Benito Mussolini, his mistress, and a few of his supporters. They are immediately executed and hung upside down from meat hooks at a gas station in Milan. In his fortified bunker, deep beneath his bombed-out offices, Adolf Hitler learns that Soviet troops are only a mile away. The following day, Hitler and Eva Braun, his wife of only 2 days, kill themselves. After giving the corpse of his Führer a final salute, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels poisons his 6 children. Then he and his wife order an SS officer to shoot them in the back of the head. What is left of the German High Command surrenders to the Allies. After 5 years and 8 months of unbridled violence, the war in Europe is over.
The first time we heard about it was through the radio from our company area that the war Germany surrendered. And I can tell you one thing, that was the biggest drunk we ever had. We were drunk.
The Nazi concentration camps housed death on a massive scale. Some living skeletons emerge from the darkness, naked, their hair shorn, their gold teeth ripped from their mouths, and piles of corpses remain. Of the 11 million Jews Hitler planned to exterminate, he succeeded in killing 6 million of them.
The SS and Gestapo had hurriedly buried many of their victims in mass graves to keep the bodies from falling into Allied hands. They were not successful. German civilians were forced to dig them up and give them decent burial.
I mean, it was a terrible damn thing to even see. A lot of Germans got killed telling us that it didn't happen.
With Germany and Italy out of the war, Japan now feels the full brunt of Allied power.
All those, you see war movies, you see those big puffs of black smoke. That's that shell exploding. And it raced out with her engine and her wings and everything else.
On his 6th mission over Japan, tail gunner Richard Vanden Heuvel sees an anti-aircraft shell explode just feet from his plane.
The pilot radioed and said, we lost 6 foot off our right wing. Engine number 4 is out, 3 is out, bomb bays are shot out. And we had some tail damage. And that's when we jumped.
As the B-29 loses altitude, a U.S. submarine patrolling the area films the crash of Vanden Heuvel's B-29. And the crew's subsequent rescue, including Vanden Heuvel himself.
That's the first time in B-29 history that they picked up the whole crew. That was unheard of. Usually you pick up 3, 4. They just don't pick up the whole crew. But they did pick up the whole crew.
The Japanese military now decides to fully implement its policy of kamikaze, or divine wind. Suicide pilots toast their homeland and emperor, board planes loaded with explosives, and fly those planes into Allied ships. Albert D'Amico witnesses the horror firsthand.
The kamikaze was bombarding and sinking our ships, left and right.
The policy proves terribly effective. Kamikazes sink 27 Navy vessels, killing almost 5,000 sailors.
They were attacking us every day and night. They wouldn't let us sleep. In other words, we were up all night and all day. Some of us fell asleep while on anti-aircraft guns.
Back on Okinawa, flamethrowers, tanks, air and ground assaults slowly annihilate the Japanese defenders. $150,000 civilians die in the maelstrom. When it finally ends on June 22, 1945, 12,500 Allied troops are dead, and 64,000 are wounded or shell-shocked. Okinawa stands as the bloodiest battle in the Pacific War. At the Allied conference at Potsdam, President Truman learns the atomic bomb was successfully tested. The Allies calculate the costs of invading Japan's home islands at least 250,000 American casualties. After discussing it with Churchill, Truman decides to use this new weapon against Japan.
Our takeoff was perfectly routine. We climbed up to our altitudes, started on our way to our rendezvous at Iwo Jima.
A specially fitted B-29 named the Enola Gay carries Little Boy, a bomb that uses a uranium bullet to cause a nuclear explosion.
My navigator had me perfectly lined up with the target. When I touched in with my sight, I could clearly see the city of Hiroshima within my bomb sight.
The bomb was finally released exactly at the designated hour, and the explosion occurred as planned. We saw this cloud of boiling dust and debris below us with this tremendous mushroom on top. Beneath that was hidden the ruins of the city of Hiroshima.
70,000 civilians die in the explosion. Another 70,000 are injured. Japan's fanatical leaders debate possible responses, but do not surrender. A second nuclear bomb, called Fat Man, uses plutonium to create a nuclear blast. It's loaded onto a B-29 named Boxcar and flies toward Japan. The primary target is the Japanese city of Kokura, which is shrouded in cloud cover.
We made 3 runs on it, but were unable to get into it. We picked our route into the secondary target, which was Nagasaki. When the clouds opened up, the target was there pretty as a picture. I made the run, let the bomb go.
Fat Man detonates over an industrial area in a valley in the city. The hilly geography limits the damage. Nonetheless, the explosion kills 75,000 Japanese.
My reaction was horror in the fact that it could devastate a whole city. But I didn't blame the president at all. You either use this, kill a ton of people, or not use it and lose a ton of people on our side. That's no choice.
Six days later, Emperor Hirohito, noting Russia's declaration of war on Japan and the presence of a new and terrible weapon, finally orders his military to surrender all Japanese forces to the Allies. The battleship USS Missouri steams into Tokyo Bay. On September 2nd, Japanese diplomat Mamoru Shigemitsu and General Yoshijiro Umetsu signed the formal surrender documents. General Douglas MacArthur leads the Allied delegation.
From this solemn occasion, a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past. A world dedicated to the dignity of man and the fulfillment of his most cherished wish for freedom, tolerance, and justice.
More than 50 countries suffered casualties during World War II. Over 24 million military deaths and 45 million civilians killed.
Glad I did it. I wouldn't trade it for anything. It was not that it was fun, but I say it's a part of my life, and just lucky that I lived through it.
Had we not won that war, then life as we know it would never have existed again.
Somebody says, well, what are you over there fighting for? I said, so you wouldn't have to learn to speak German.
They knew why they fought. They knew every day could be their last. But they kept on doing and dying.
You couldn't imagine young boys, faces shot off, legs blown off from landmines, and they never complained. War is hell. We saw it firsthand.
Our generation was an odd generation. We came home from the war, and everyone wanted to resume his life. And there was no patting on the back. Look what all that I did. They bore in. They got jobs and went on with their business. So they didn't talk much about the war.
I just took it for granted. We all figured we'd come out alive, but down deep we knew we wouldn't.
I'm very proud that I was able to do what I did and help out this country as much as I did, if I did. And I'm proud of all the veterans that served with me. All the veterans that didn't come home, they're the heroes. I'm not. I came home. That's all I could say, I guess.